And now I would like to introduce Hongyu Chen. Hongyu Chen is a sixth-year PhD student in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, specializing in Iranian studies and Egyptology. Hong spent his early years in a village in Fujian province in southern China before immigrating to the United States. He received his BA in History and Near Eastern Studies from the Johns Hopkins University in 2019 and his MA in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures from UCLA in 2023. He specializes in the language, religion, and cultural developments of Egypt under Achaemenid Imperial rule. He is a student of both Egyptian and Iranian languages, ranging from the Old Egyptian of the pyramids to the Avestan and Pahlavi of the Zoroastrian texts from the Middle Ages. Using these languages and a better understanding of both cultures' religions, he hopes to reconstruct a more nuanced and complex narrative of empire, religion, and cross-cultural communication in the first millennium BC. And Hong will be speaking to us about... Do I have to do that? Yeah, come. I can do it. Come. Right there. Only children can read that.
Egyptian religious intellectualism under the Achaemenid Empire, compilation, maintenance, and expansion.
That was the best introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. That was a great introduction and far too verbose, really, for me. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for allowing me a platform to present some ongoing dissertation-related research on identity building within the Achaemenid Empire, particularly in the imperial province of Egypt, as we all just heard. When considering the ancient Iranian context of the Hebrew Bible, the potential similarities between the imperial processes taking place in Egypt and the Egyptian people, and those that took place within the Levant, which ultimately generated the socio-political contexts for the creation of certain biblical books, are clear. Both regions were subjected to the rule of the Achaemenid Empire. Both regions were places where imperial power was etched into the landscape through temple building. And the elites of both regions ultimately renegotiated their group and individual identities in light of their new imperial overlords. The process of identity formation undergone by Egyptian elites of the Achaemenid Empire represents a non-unique manifestation of the effects of broader imperial programs. And the results can perhaps highlight some of the potentially similar processes that occurred in the Achaemenid Levant. A potential impact of the Achaemenid Empire was the transformation of the religious formation and landscape of the respective regions and cultures. Indeed, Achaemenid imperial rule generated major shifts within Egypt. Within this context, the elevation of the visibility of priests within the institutions of Egyptian royal rituals, recognizable in the decoration of the Temple of Amun at Hibis, should be viewed as the indirect result of Achaemenid imperial practices, filtered through the complex perspectives on sacred knowledge within the local Egyptian priesthood. Much like in Ezra 7, when Ezra is addressed as both priest and scribe, crucial to the identity of the Egyptian elites of this period are their dual roles as both imperial administrators and as hereditary priests of their local temples. Particularly, hereditary priesthood and the lineage in this context established an Egyptian within his office. Does this work? Excellent. Okay, so the most famous imperial official of the early Achaemenid Empire is the Egyptian Uja-Horeznet, son of Payef-Chau-Em-Awineh. His statue, housed at the Vatican, needs little introduction. It is perhaps the most complex biographical statue across the entirety of Egyptian history, comprised of over a dozen distinct inscriptions detailing both historical and religious themes pertaining to Uja-Horeznet's self-presentation. On the statue, its commissioner provided the incredibly complex set of administrative and priestly titles that he held, demonstrating both his role within the administration and, crucially, his pedigree as an Egyptian priest. Banally, he was an Iri Patenhatia, the traditional terms for hereditary noble and count, which marked him as a member of the elite social class. Then a long list of other titles followed. Distinctly, none of these titles actually attribute to Uja-Horeznet as any sort of priest or temple. Primarily, they seem to be associated with the court and administrative writing, such as inspecting scribe or scribe of the court. However, his father, Payef-Chau-Em-Awineh, is provided with several important priestly titles. He was administrator of the estates of the temples of Nath, the chief of Buto, two distinct types of priest, and a prophet of Nath, foremost of Sais. And Uja-Haresnet likely inherited these titles from his father. It is then presumably within his role as an Egyptian priest that the lengthy narrative of temple restoration and salvation follow. Uja-Haresnet says, "I cause that His Majesty understand, Sia, to really comprehend and digest the greatness of the city of Sais. It was the seat of the great Nath, the mother who bore the sun god, initiating birth when birth had not yet come into being. And the character of the greatness of the Temple of Nath, it was higher in all of its character," and so forth. Much of Uja-Haresnet's goals in these narratives on the statue were, in fact, to relay to his audience the restoration of temple rituals and the reestablishment of many priestly functions associated with them. However, he also expresses his personal role in educating the foreign Achaemenid king in the proper religious matters of Egypt. Joseph Blenkinsop has noted the similarities between the activities and positions of Uja-Haresnet and those of the biblical figures of Ezra and Nehemiah, using inscriptions of the statue to, in his words, get help wherever we can get it, to understand these texts. Representing an excellent introduction to potential similarities, the Egyptian context of the actions of this Egyptian priest was, however, overlooked, as were the complexities and motivations expressed within the two different phases of restoration. The Egyptian motivations for temple building should be connected to the direct aims of the Achaemenid Empire, as foreign conquerors unfamiliar with local practices. The Egyptian ideology of temple building was perhaps not only incorporated into Achaemenid imperial strategy, but directly influenced by it. One of the traditional roles of the Egyptian king was as the principal builder of monuments to the Egyptian gods. The building and provision of Egyptian temples play significant roles within the royal inscriptions and dedicatory texts of the New Kingdom, a period considered an apogee within the history of Egyptian monumental construction. By the Achaemenid period, Egyptian kings had long been dedicating monumental constructions and restorations with explicit references to their roles in such activity. Temples were monuments which the king made as houses for his divine fathers. This general practice of presenting the king as the principal builder of divine houses should then be of no surprise when manifested in the practice of the Achaemenid king, as expressed and executed through his Egyptian agents. The practice allowed certain kings to inflict their royal presence upon elaborate ritual landscapes, adding and amending their names and deeds to long-established temple spaces, and perhaps even obliterating the names and deeds of other kings before them. Such claims of building primarily focus on the erecting of physical aspects of the temple, building the portals, gateways, and sanctuaries of the gods. The addition of the king's names to temples reminded the Egyptian elites of royal patronage, especially as ritual and festivals were being patronized and performed by them. However, seldom stressed in the monumental record is the enactment or reenactment of destitute rituals. Yet the importance of Egyptian rituals was widely known within the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid historian Herodotus notes the incredible importance of festivals and processions to the people of Egypt. The author writes in his book, too, concerning the noted frequency of festivals in cities such as Bubastis, Busiris, Thebes, Heliopolis, and, as one expects, Sais, whose cultic restorations were the primary focus of Uja-Haresnet. Ignoring entirely the contentious question of whether Herodotus indeed visited Egypt, it nonetheless indicates an imperial literary perspective on Egypt and its obsession with festivals and oracles, both seemingly to have been associated with priestly endeavors by the author. Herodotus reports constantly that he receives much of his knowledge of Egypt from conversations with Egyptian priests. He is careful to regularly shift his understanding onto his priestly sources. He writes, "So much was told to me by the Egyptian priests. Thus far went the record given to me by the Egyptians and their priests." It is this priestly knowledge that ultimately served imperial elites, and the biblical narratives likewise heavily emphasize the specialist nature of their elite protagonists. In Egypt, the local elite's knowledge of priestly practices was functionally necessary for the perpetuation of local religion under the new imperial regime. Along these lines, Uja-Haresnet inserted himself and expressed his own importance in the imperial restoration of temple by two Achaemenid kings, particularly in the reestablishment of the intangible aspect of temple activity rather than the physical restoration of the temple itself. He states that His Majesty Cambyses commanded the purification of the Temple of Nath and the placing to it of all its people, its staff. His Majesty commanded all that which was in their festivals and all their oracles, like that which was done before. Through this restoration of temple activity, participating Egyptian priests such as Ujer-Haresnet were given the opportunity to re-examine their intellectual property and their place within function of Egyptian ritual activity. When Ujer-Haresnet says that I place them in possession of all knowledge and all their work, he elaborates carefully on his actual intellectual labor on behalf of the Achaemenid king. He is re-educating or restoring the damaged or insufficient temple archives, providing the temple priests of Sais with the rituals and spells that had ostensibly been within the temple before in new written copies. Darius was made known of the usefulness of the priestly endeavors, the medical and ritual uses of the priestly knowledge that this individual possessed. On a practical level, the king apparently saw the benefits of allowing to continue such priestly practices and was credited with the financial patronage. However, beyond the accounts of Ujer-Haresnet, little can be said about the Temple of Neith at Sais. In fact, much like the issue of the Second Temple, none of the temples mentioned by Herodotus preserve enough traces to understand whatever complexities were introduced by the local priestly elites during the Achaemenid period. However, despite this major problem of preservation, I argue that there is still enough sufficient evidence to suggest something interesting occurred within the Achaemenid period concerning priestly thought and its manifestations on a monumental scale, including a renegotiation that ultimately allowed for the transition and transformation of earlier religious scenes and texts to acquire new nuances. This, particularly as I hope to demonstrate, affected the imagination of the Egyptian elite within their own ritual practice and relationship to the figure of the king, the principal Egyptian ritualist. So here's where I go on to the Temple of Amun at Hibis, which preserves enough of the period's decoration to suggest a visible attempt by decorating elites to compile, negotiate, and interpret different religious iconography and liturgy into one cohesive functional space for expressing the royal power of the Achaemenid Great King. Decorated during the reign of Darius I, the Temple of Amun at Hibis remains a standing monument to the king's reign as monarch over Egypt and all the lands. Importantly, it also stands as physical evidence of Achaemenid temple construction performed by local priests, funded by the Great King in Persia. Elaborate and lengthy religious hymns on a scale hitherto unattested at monumental scales on Egyptian temple walls are found at Hibis. The temple features a combination of traditional royal offering scenes, such as the scene of Darius offering provisions before a tetrad of Osiris, Horus, Isis, and Nephthys, and iconography representing the coronation of Darius before different assemblies of divine actors and by different means. Despite the temple being described as a house of his father, Amun, Lord of Hibis, the temple is fundamentally dedicated to the ritual exchange between the king and the gods of the temple. Through his interaction with the gods, the king receives rulership over the lands and the foreign lands. So, focusing on an example from the northwestern cemetery of the temple, I will attempt to demonstrate how the relationship between the king and the god is reestablished using traditional motifs, and how the elites asserted and emphasized their own role within well-established royal rituals. So, Sanctuary K is dedicated to the revivification of the dead god Osiris. I will focus on this culminating scene at the end of, at the rear of the awakening of Osiris at the heart of this sanctuary, which shows a distinct reorganization of long-held Egyptian ideas on father-son inheritance and mortuary rites. The culmination of this ritual focuses on the resurrection of Osiris by the king as Horus, the divine king of Egypt. The royal myth of Horus and Osiris needs little explanation. However, I will provide a brief summary here and explain broadly the relationship between the divine myth and Egyptian kingship. So, the final three kings of the Egyptian mythic divine line of kings were the gods Osiris, Seth, and Horus. And the succession of the three kings formed the basis of Egyptian royal succession, or at least one of the bases. In the royal narrative, Osiris has died, and a conflict ensues between his brother Seth and his son Horus for the throne of Egypt. Later conceptions explicitly identify Seth as the killer of Osiris, a usurper, and then Horus, for his part in the later narrative, functioned as the divine protagonist, the legitimate heir of his father. As part of the legitimate inheritance process, Horus must perform the funerary rites for his father, including the Osirian resurrection, bringing back the dead god so that he might speak and give to his son the throne of Egypt. This divine process then becomes the divine model by which an Egyptian king could inherit the throne from his own father. By enacting the rites, the Egyptian king himself becomes Horus and the king. Now, critical for my talk, within the divine narrative, the ibis-headed Thoth functions as Horus's ally, a knowledgeable priest and scribe who restores to the king's son his eye after it was wounded in a physical contest with Seth. So this relief at the end of the set of the Chambers of Sanctuary K depicts a familiar yet adapted scene of a recumbent Osiris upon his funerary bier, at the moment of Osirian resurrection. At Hibis, the ibis-headed Thoth, the priest, scribe, and physician of the gods, holds the ritual wasp scepter to the nose of the dead god. This specific religious scene is attested several times in monuments of the earlier Egyptian New Kingdom and Third Intermediate Period. The most famous of these are the set of parallel scenes from the cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos. You then have one at the tomb of Ramses VI in Thebes, and then another at the tomb of Sheshonq III at Tanis, and a couple others. The ritual depicted in these parallel scenes always features the figure of the king, identified by the king's Horus name. This is the oldest of the king's titularies and the one that most clearly identifies him with the falcon god and the son of the dead king. In these earlier scenes, the king's action is also labeled to link him to Horus, son of Osiris, directly, described as protecting his father in the standard expression of Horus's divine role. Joshua Roberson has suggested that the depiction of the sculptor grinding at the stone, seen here, is also a literal representation of the creation of the statue, and that's the first sign in the group here. Which often described in the Egyptian of the New Kingdom as being a sort of vivification of the statue and the god. As such, the visual of the hieroglyph could convey two meanings across different registers of understanding. The first register conveys the meaning of vivification through a literal reading of the depicted action in the glyph. The king is a ritualist activating the divine image. The second register of interpretation requires the understanding of this enigmatic text, which reveals the formulaic function performed by the king in the divine realm. He is Horus protecting Osiris. The royal label for Horus's protection of his father is not the only enigmatic text in the traditional version of the scene. The inscription above the scene, a statement by the god Osiris after his revivification, is also rendered enigmatically. The occurrence of this scene in multiple versions within royal mortuary context is not surprising, since the vivification of Osiris in the afterlife is crucial for maintaining the cosmos and a primary role of Egyptian kingship. In the context of the royal tomb, the king's presence within the ritual is both as principal ritualist and as the revivified Osiris, affirming royal succession and also the king's transfiguration into God in the netherworld. However, at Hibis, the scene seems to serve a similar function, albeit through a different perspective. There are clear emendations to the earlier versions of the scene for the Hibis version, even if associated rituals might have remained similar. These emendations likely allowed certain meanings to be derived based on the individual's engagement with the scene at different registers. Firstly, the enigmatic text of earlier versions has been completely removed and replaced by a standard hieroglyphic text, beginning with Horus's reception of the white and red crown, thereby becoming the legitimate king. The actual revivification of the dead god is not explicated, expressed entirely through the visual representation of Thoth holding the scepter to the Osirian corpse. While still maintaining the context of Osirian rebirth through this visual scheme, the inscription further contextualized the imagery to convey the subsequent result of ritual action. Osiris now also explicitly gives Horus the office of kingship and rules over the four cardinal directions. This Hibis text characterizes and expresses the relationship between the dead Osiris and a still living Horus, performing the task of the successor to obtain the inheritance, which has been described in abstract terms. The example at Hibis deviates from its precursors, more explicit in its purpose. The image and accompanying text were both altered to create new meaning within the temple space. So then what about this image of Thoth? As alluded to earlier, another major change between the earlier precursors and the example at Hibis is the prominence of the figure Thoth in the scene of Osirian resurrection, rather than that of the king. Whereas the king is usually depicted as alone performing the ritual of awakening before an audience of gods, among whom Thoth was an occasional member, Thoth takes an active role in this Hibis version. I argue that Thoth's fronting as the principal active ritualist emphasizes the role of the priest within the practice of Egyptian royal rituals, particularly in this text. So at Hibis, Thoth plays many active roles in the ritual practice of kingship, particularly as an aide. Here are 3 examples from other crucial scenes at Hibis where Thoth plays prominent roles in the legitimation of the king and his reign. The upper left depicts Thoth etching the name of the king upon the leaves of the nebes tree, a motif that occurs across the New Kingdom. Thoth is one of the potential inscribers of the name alongside other deities such as the sun god Ra-Harakti. The lower left has Thoth being the officiant of the union of the king with the gods Geb and Nut. The right depicts the famous unification of the 2 lands beneath the king's throne. Here, Thoth and Horus function together to perform the ritual that brings together Egypt under the king's reign. So then the king and the priest are working together in order to rule over Egypt. The prominence of Thoth within both contexts and elsewhere in the temple as a principal ritualist perhaps influenced the decorating priest to insert Thoth into the ritual of Sanctuary K in parallel. The prominence of the figure of Thoth within the depictions at Hibis Temple emphasizes the role of the local elites, their active participation in temple building and ritual maintenance, and the importance of their sacred knowledge to the maintenance of Egyptian kingship when a native Egyptian king is absent. The biographical inscription of Uja-Haresnet makes clear the importance of these local elites in establishing traditional practices in temple spaces that might have been deemed insufficient. When presented with the choice of figures to promote visual representations of royal rituals, the priest chose the ones most likely to mark their own participation in the ritual process. Those that include the god Thoth, the divine scribe, and the greatest ritualist among the gods. The god Thoth's roles all equate him well with the Egyptian elites who use their knowledge and training to concretize empire within their local spaces. He is the lord of the divine words. He is the foremost of the house of scrolls, the judge of the twin rivals, the pacifier of the twin gods, the lord of rectitude or ma'at or truth, and the creator of occasions ritually. Through these titles, Thoth is positioned as both a priest and a scribe among the gods, a divine agent who helps the king's ascension and enacts the king's will through both legal and ritual means. His insertion into a monumental depiction of a ritual previously exclusive to the Egyptian king is highly meaningful, especially since this is the only example where the king is not the direct performer of the ritual. It casts the ritual as a concerted effort between king and elite, wherein the elite, with his education and knowledge, enables effective royal inheritance. This expression of the local elite's role within the newly stabilized Achaemenid Empire under Darius I concords well with the same sort of presentation that elites, such as Uja-Haresnet and figures in biblical books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and Esther, whose use of their knowledge of their local or traditional beliefs allowed them to educate and effectively integrate a foreign king into their traditions, is crucial. I hope that I have provided examples of the broader processes of intellectual production resulting from engagements with the Achaemenid Empire, and the nuances that were employed in local religious adaptation by local agents. Local elites like Uja-Haresnet played crucial roles in accommodating empire into regional frameworks of kingship through their positions as both administrators and as priests. These real figures and their actions within the empire likely created entrenched ideas in their communities about how local elites and empire interacted both specifically and broadly. Through these processes, the imperial elites, be they Egyptian or Judean, use their specialized knowledge to transform not only their own indigenous rituals and religious thoughts within imperial contexts, but also the Achaemenid king into the stand-in for their native one, reconciling the foreign occupier into the position of an otherwise unavailable kingly figure. Thank you.